Before Noah built the ark, before the first drop of judgment ever touched the earth, something else came first. Not kings, not empires, not even war as men would come to know it. It began when heaven looked down at humanity, and some among the watchers desired what was never theirs to touch. And from that forbidden crossing came a race so powerful, so violent, so unnatural, that the world itself began to collapse beneath their feet. This is the story of the Nephilim.
In the beginning, the earth did not know fear. There were no battlefields scarred by blood, no towers blackened by fire, no kings hungry for power. The world was young, radiant and untouched, still glowing with the freshness of creation itself. The rivers moved like silver through untouched valleys. Mountains rose in quiet majesty beneath a sky so clear it seemed endless. Every sunrise felt like a blessing, and every living thing moved in rhythm with the breath of the Creator. Humanity walked through that world with wonder still alive in its eyes. There was no shame yet woven into the soul, no violence pulsing beneath ambition. Man drank from clean waters, rested beneath generous trees, and lived in a creation that still sang in harmony with heaven. The earth was not yet a graveyard of broken promises. It was a garden of possibility. But above that peace, something began to shift. Beyond the firmament, where celestial beings moved in obedience and light bent before eternal glory, there were angels appointed to watch over the world below. They were guardians, witnesses, servants of divine order. They looked upon the sons and daughters of men from the heights, observing the unfolding beauty of mortal life. At first it was only curiosity, a passing thought, a quiet fascination. But curiosity is dangerous when it lingers too long near what is forbidden. The watchers began to study humanity not as distant observers, but with longing. They saw love, laughter, touch, sorrow, and desire. They saw men and women bound together by something they themselves had never known: flesh, fragility, intimacy, choice, the ache of mortality, the mystery of affection. And what had once been holy distance slowly turned into restless desire. Among them stood Semjaza, chief among the watchers. He was not reckless, not at first. He was wise, revered, and powerful. But there was unrest in him, a dissatisfaction he could no longer silence. Around him gathered others who shared the same dangerous fascination: Arakiba, Ramil, Kokabiel, Tamiel, Ramiel, Danel, Ezekiel, Barakiel, Asael, and many more. Beings formed in glory, now staring downward, with hearts no longer at peace. Then came the night that changed everything. On the summit of Mount Hermon, beneath the moon pale as bone, and winds heavy with omen, 200 watchers gathered in silence. The mountain stood like a witness before heaven and earth. Clouds crawled across the sky, the stars seemed to hold their breath. And there, on that sacred height, Semjaza spoke. He looked upon his brothers and confessed what many of them had already begun to feel. He wanted to descend. He wanted to take wives from among the daughters of men. He wanted to cross the line heaven had drawn. Some trembled at the thought. Others felt the same hunger already burning in their own hearts. They knew what this meant. This was not curiosity anymore. This was rebellion. This was a decision from which there would be no return. And still, one by one, they agreed. Hands were extended beneath the cold light of the moon. Voices joined in a terrible unity. An oath was sworn on Mount Hermon. They bound themselves to one another so that none would turn back in fear once judgment came. It was the covenant of their fall. Then the heavens were pierced. The watchers descended from the heights like streaks of living fire, tearing through the night as if the stars themselves had been cast down. When they touched the earth, they took the form of men, tall, radiant, imposing, beautiful in a way no mortal king had ever been. Their presence carried the echo of another realm. Their eyes seemed too ancient, their voices too deep, their silence too heavy. And when humanity saw them, wonder became surrender. The daughters of men were drawn to them. Entire villages gathered to behold them. Their beauty inspired awe. Their knowledge inspired reverence. Their power inspired devotion. And where reverence grows without wisdom, worship soon follows. But the watchers did not come empty-handed. They brought knowledge, forbidden knowledge. They taught men how to shape iron and bronze into weapons. They taught the crafting of blades, armor, and instruments of war. They revealed enchantments, hidden arts, celestial signs, the movements of the stars, the secrets of roots and herbs, and mysteries that mortal hands were never meant to wield without restraint. Humanity learned too quickly. Cities rose where there had once been open fields, towers climbed toward the heavens, temples were carved with celestial symbols, altars gleamed in the dawn, forges burned through the night like miniature suns. Men no longer sought merely to live, they sought to rule. And then the children were born. At first they seemed only strange, larger, stronger, different. But they did not remain children for long. They grew with terrifying speed. Their bodies stretched beyond human proportion. Their strength multiplied beyond imagination. Their footsteps shook the earth. Their eyes carried something unnatural, not fully human, not fully celestial, but something broken between both. They were called the Nephilim, giants of impossible blood, the offspring of heaven's rebellion and earth's desire. And once they began to rise, the world would never be the same again.
The rise of the Nephilim did not happen quietly. It happened like a storm swallowing the horizon. At first, humanity looked upon them with awe. Their size alone was enough to shatter reason. These were not merely powerful men, they were colossal beings who moved through the earth like forces of nature. As they matured, their bodies became monuments of living strength. Their arms could uproot trees, their hands could tear stone from mountain faces, their voices rolled across valleys like thunder. Every step they took made the ground answer beneath them. And men did what men so often do when confronted with overwhelming power. They bowed. The Nephilim were worshipped, statues were raised in their honor, songs were sung in their names, priests offered incense before giant altars, kings laid their crowns at their feet. Entire nations began to treat them not as creatures, but as gods walking among mortals. Fear and fascination merged into one poisoned devotion. And the watchers, at least for a time, mistook this for greatness. Samjaza looked upon what had been born from rebellion and saw magnificence. Towers gleamed beneath the sun, temples pierced the sky. The earth had become more advanced, more structured, more powerful than ever before. It looked from a distance like triumph. But Asael saw something different. He saw rot beneath the gold. Because power without obedience never stays beautiful for long. The Nephilim had inherited more than strength. They had inherited appetite, and appetite without limits becomes destruction.
At first, they devoured what the earth offered. Herds vanished, harvests disappeared before they could be gathered, forests were stripped bare, rivers were muddied by endless movement and waste. Fields that once fed nations became barren under their hunger. But the earth could not sustain them forever, and when the food ran out, they turned to blood. That was when admiration died. The giants who had once been praised as living gods became tyrants of terror. Villages were erased in a single night. Men were hunted like prey. Cities once radiant with pride became graveyards of ash and shattered stone. The songs of celebration were replaced by screams. The laughter of children gave way to the clash of metal and the thunder of colossal footsteps. Blood began to run through the valleys, and not as metaphor. The world was changing into something darker than anyone had imagined. Humanity itself was changing too, because the Watchers had not only corrupted the body of the world, they had corrupted the soul of it. War became organized, violence became strategy, power became religion. Men no longer fought only from fear or survival. They fought for dominance, for territory, for glory, for the thrill of conquest. Brother rose against brother, kingdom consumed kingdom. Human sacrifice stained the altars beneath skies that once knew only peace. The knowledge of heaven had become the weapon of hell, and still the corruption spread. Under Asael's teachings, iron became a language of death. Forges roared through the night, birthing blades sharp enough to carve kingdoms apart. Armor gleamed beneath torchlight, spears split the air, shields rose like walls between men who had forgotten they were once made to live in peace. Others among the fallen revealed hidden arts, charms, enchantments, celestial calculations, forbidden symbols carved into black stone and temple walls. Knowledge multiplied faster than wisdom. Men learned how to command, but not how to restrain. They learned how to build, but not why. They learned how to reach upward, while everything within them sank lower. Soon the earth was covered in monuments of brilliance and decay. Gigantic temples rose with pillars engraved in symbols taken from heaven but twisted by rebellion. Eternal flames burned upon their summits like counterfeit stars. Massive statues of winged beings towered over cities. Gold glittered beside blood-stained stone. Beauty and horror stood side by side until no one could tell where reverence ended and corruption began. And among the giants, one figure towered above the rest, Og. He was more fortress than flesh, scarred, brutal, immense. His body looked like it had been carved from ancient rock and hammered by war itself. He wore the hides of monstrous beasts and a crown forged from bone and twisted metal. When he stood before the multitude, he looked less like a ruler and more like a living judgment upon mankind. And when he spoke, the earth listened. Men are weak, we were born to rule. That was the creed of the Nephilim. Not stewardship, not responsibility, rule. To them, humanity was no longer kin, it was livestock, tribute, fuel for their appetite and pride. And deep down, the Watchers began to realize what they had done. Some still clung to their arrogance, refusing to see the truth, but others could no longer ignore it. Their sons had become monsters. Their rebellion had birthed an empire built not on glory, but on domination, slaughter, and blasphemy. Still, by then, it was too late, because heaven had already seen. The signs began quietly. The stars seemed dimmer, the skies grew heavier, winds moved strangely across the earth, carrying a coldness that did not belong to any natural season. Mount Hermon, where the oath had first been sworn, stood under gathering clouds as though it had become the center of a sentence waiting to be spoken. Then one day the heavens answered. A light descended upon Hermon, not warm, not gentle, judicial. The wind stopped, trees stood motionless, seas fell silent, even the giants paused in their roaming. And then a voice echoed across the world, ancient, absolute, impossible to ignore. The earth groans beneath the weight of your corruption. The spirit of man will not endure forever. Those words did not sound like rage, they sounded like verdict. Samjaza lifted his face toward the heavens and for the first time since his descent saw not possibility but consequence. He remembered what he had been. He felt the fading echo of glory now slipping from him like dying embers. And in that moment, even he understood. Judgment had already begun to walk the earth. Not yet in flood, not yet in fire, but in certainty. The world had crossed a line from which it would not return. And somewhere beneath darkening skies, while giants still feasted and kings still trembled and altars still burned, heaven was already preparing its response.
After the warning came silence, and sometimes silence is more terrifying than thunder. The world continued moving, but now everything felt like it was leaning toward collapse. The sky no longer looked innocent, the wind no longer sounded clean, even the sunlight seemed hesitant, as if creation itself had begun to recoil from what walked upon it. Cities still glittered, but their beauty had become a mask stretched over decay. Beneath the gold, the world was rotting. And in that corruption, one man still walked differently. His name was Enoch. He was not a king, not a warrior, not a priest surrounded by marble pillars and public honor. He was simply a man who still looked upward when others had learned to look only at power. While giants ruled the plains and blood soaked the earth, Enoch moved through the broken world with a different kind of weight inside him. The burden of seeing what humanity had become and still believing that heaven had not turned away forever. He saw ruined cities, desecrated altars, smoke rising over lands once fertile. He saw mothers mourning, children trembling, and men bowing before idols that could not save them. He heard the echo of violence everywhere he walked. The earth itself seemed to groan beneath the burden of innocent blood. And Enoch did what the world had forgotten how to do. He cried out to God. That cry was heard. One night, while the earth slept beneath clouds thick with omen, Enoch was overtaken by visions. Not ordinary dreams, not fragments of fear. These were revelations. Rivers of fire flowing down mountains, burning wings falling from the heavens like dying leaves, giants collapsing in battle, towers splitting apart, a light rising beyond destruction. He awoke with his heart pounding, and then the presence came. Light descended before him, golden, overwhelming, holy. It drove the shadows backward as if dawn itself had entered the world through a single point. Enoch fell to his knees, overcome by fear and reverence, and before him stood Uriel, messenger of the Most High. The angel's words were not soft, they were clear. The blood of the innocent had reached heaven, the time for response had come. Enoch was chosen, not because he was mighty, not because he was feared, but because faith had remained alive in him when the rest of the world had nearly extinguished it.
He was told to arise because he would become a messenger between man and the eternal. And in an instant, the world disappeared beneath his feet. Enoch was carried beyond the known heavens. What opened before him was not merely a place, it was a reality too vast for mortal language. He saw mountains of crystal reflecting unseen stars, rivers of fire moving like living thought, pathways of light stretching into immeasurable distance, thrones radiant with glory, hosts of heavenly beings bowed in reverence before a holiness no corruption could approach. The air itself seemed alive with worship. Every sound proclaimed the majesty of the Creator. And then Enoch stood before Michael, commander of heavenly hosts. His presence was like restrained war. His armor shone like the first light of creation. His wings carried the memory of battles older than time itself. When he spoke, his voice did not merely enter the air, it entered the soul. He told Enoch what must now be declared. There would be no forgiveness for the Watchers. Their rebellion had crossed the boundary of mercy. Their sons, the Nephilim, would perish, and the fallen angels who shattered the eternal order would be bound until the day of final judgment. It was not a warning anymore. It was sentence. Then Enoch was sent back. He returned to the cold heights of Mount Hermon, the very mountain where rebellion had first been sworn. Lightning crawled through the clouds, the wind carried the scent of stone and storm, and before he even reached them, the Watchers sensed his coming. Samjaza stepped forward to meet him, but he no longer looked like a prince of heaven. His radiance had dimmed, regret hung upon him like a second garment. The weight of what he had done had finally become impossible to deny. And for the first time, the leader of the fallen asked for mercy. He begged Enoch to intercede. He confessed that their children had destroyed what they were meant to protect. He pleaded for a word of forgiveness, for some sign that the Almighty might still relent. But Enoch carried no comfort, only truth. He looked upon Samjaza with compassion and with unshakable firmness. There would be no more intercession. Heaven had decreed the end. The abyss would be their resting place. Their children would fall beneath the sword of judgment. The empire born from rebellion would be shattered. And when those words were spoken, lament broke across the mountain. The Watchers wept. Some fell to their knees, others covered their faces. Their cries moved through the valleys like a funeral wind. They had desired the world below, and now the world below had become the witness of their ruin. Samjaza lifted his eyes one last time toward the darkened heavens and understood the bitter truth. What they had loved had become the seed of their destruction. But while the Watchers grieved, the Nephilim did not. Far below, the giants still roared in hollow celebration. They still believed strength could defy destiny. They still thought power could stand against heaven. They did not know the clock of justice was already counting down, and heaven was no longer waiting.
What came next was not merely punishment, it was purification. After Enoch's warning, the heavens moved with terrifying precision. This was no chaotic burst of anger. This was judgment with order, purpose, finality. Far above the broken world, before the blazing throne of the Most High, the decree was given. The corruption of the earth had reached its limit. The cry of the innocent had risen too high to be ignored. Mercy had not been absent. It had been rejected. Now justice would descend. Michael stood before the throne like a blade waiting to be drawn. Raphael, Gabriel, and Uriel rose beside him, each receiving a charge that would reshape the world. Raphael would cast down Asael, the corrupter who had armed humanity with violence. Gabriel would move against the Nephilim and break the tyranny of their bloodline. Michael would bind Samjaza and the Watchers who had shattered the covenant of heaven.
and Uriel would continue to guide the righteous through the darkness that remained. Then heaven moved. Enoch was shown what was coming in visions too terrible to forget. He saw giant armies turning against one another. He saw cities consumed in flame, idols shattered, temples collapsing, and the pride of the Nephilim crushed beneath its own weight. He saw blood and fire, but beyond them he also saw something else, a remnant, a promise, a man not yet fully understood by the world, but already chosen by God, Noah. And as that name entered the story, the final chapter began. But before the waters came, the giants had to fall. The heavenly hosts descended in silence over the devastated plains. Lightning split the heavens. The clouds churned like gates opening. Angelic legions hovered above the earth, not in panic, but in perfect formation. Their presence did not resemble myth, it resembled inevitability. At their head came Michael, not raging, not shouting, certain. The command was not to strike the giants down directly. It was something colder, something more devastating: division. Because the Nephilim had been built on pride, and pride always carries its own poison. Michael moved among them like an unseen flame. He approached one giant and whispered into his ear, "He says you are weak." Then he moved to another. "They've already chosen someone else to lead." Then another. "He fears your strength. He plans to kill you first." That was all it took, because corruption does not need much encouragement to destroy itself. Suspicion spread through the ranks of the giants like venom through blood. Eyes narrowed, grips tightened around enormous weapons. Old rivalries awakened. Pride turned instantly to paranoia, and then, with a single roar, the first blow was struck. What followed was apocalyptic. The war of the giants began. Colossal weapons crashed together with the force of mountains colliding. Clubs shattered skulls, blades split armor. Massive bodies slammed into the earth with impacts that cracked the land open beneath them. Rivers turned red. Valleys thundered with the sound of giant against giant. The Nephilim, who had once ruled men through terror, now tore each other apart in blind fury. This was not victory. It was self-consumption, exactly as heaven intended. Above the battlefield, the angelic hosts watched in solemn silence as corruption devoured itself. Michael lifted his eyes toward the storm-dark sky as the giants collapsed one after another, and in that terrible stillness, the truth became undeniable. The age of the Nephilim was ending. At the same time, Raphael descended to confront Asael, the one who had taught men violence, forged destruction into civilization, and armed rebellion with iron, was seized. No speech could save him, no power could free him. He was cast into darkness, sealed away beneath burning stone, his influence buried beneath the weight of divine decree. Then came Samjaza, once radiant, once revered, once a leader among the Watchers, now broken. Michael appeared before him in blazing silence. Samjaza did not resist. There was nothing left to defend. He had already seen the ruin his desire had birthed. Celestial chains wrapped around him like solidified lightning. His wings were bound, his glory extinguished, and with one final act of judgment, he was cast into the abyss where the other fallen awaited their sentence. The rebellion of heaven was over, but the cleansing of earth had only begun. Then silence came, a silence so deep it felt unnatural. The wind stopped. The earth seemed to hold its breath, and on the horizon the clouds began to gather, heavy, endless, alive. Raphael's voice rose among the hosts like a decree carved into eternity. The earth was washed in blood, now it will be washed in water. And the gaze of heaven turned toward Noah. While kings built monuments to themselves and giants celebrated their own strength, Noah built something that looked ridiculous to the world, an ark, on dry ground, under an empty sky. He labored with steady hands while mockery surrounded him. Men laughed, pointed, ridiculed. They saw an old man building a ship where there was no sea and assumed madness had finally claimed him. But Noah was not building according to sight. He was building according to obedience. And obedience always looks foolish to those who only trust what they can see. Then came the sign no one could explain. Animals began to arrive, 2 by 2, from every direction, walking in silence toward the ark as if summoned by a voice deeper than instinct. The earth trembled beneath the gathering of creation. The sky darkened further. Thunder rolled across the distance like the footsteps of judgment approaching. Then it began. The heavens opened. Not with a drizzle, not with a passing storm, with violence. Rain fell as if the sky itself had ruptured. The fountains of the deep burst upward from beneath the earth. Rivers broke their boundaries. Cities vanished beneath rising torrents. Mountains disappeared behind walls of water. The world that had gloried in power was now helpless before a force it could neither fight nor command. Men ran to the ark in terror, hands pounded against the wood, voices cried for mercy, but the time for warning had ended. Now came consequence. Even Og, towering in pride to his final breath, raised his arms against the storm, as if defiance could still save him. But the flood did not argue. It swallowed. A colossal wave rose above him like living judgment and dragged him into the abyss, leaving no monument, no throne, no trace. For 40 days and 40 nights the waters ruled. The old world disappeared beneath them. Cities, altars, statues, kingdoms, bloodlines, violence, pride, all of it buried, all of it silenced. And then, after the storm had spent its fury, stillness returned. The ark floated alone upon an endless gray expanse, carrying within it the fragile beginning of a new world. Noah opened the window and released a dove. It returned with a green branch in its beak, the smallest sign of life, and yet enough to make hope breathe again. And when the ark came to rest upon the mountains of Ararat, Noah stepped onto a cleansed earth, not perfect, but renewed. He built an altar, he offered thanks, and then, above him, the sky answered. A rainbow stretched across the heavens like a covenant written in light, not because judgment had been small, but because mercy had survived it. And that is the true end of the Nephilim story. Not simply that giants rose, not simply that angels fell, but that no corruption, no matter how powerful, ancient, or terrifying, can stand forever against the justice of God. Empires fall, giants drown, rebellion burns out, but the will of heaven remains. And when the world forgets its creator, history itself remembers what happened before the flood.